back to another episode of Bad Takes in Football. I am your host, Bad Takes. We'll get started with this show shortly. Excited to talk about the AFC South, the NFC South, the AFC West, and the NFC West, as well as some players from those divisions that I'm really looking forward to see. So we'll give people a little bit more time to join. Excited to talk about football. Football season is finally back. We get our first game on Thursday. Wednesday's live show, I'll be going over game previews for the week, specifically focusing on that Thursday game as well as those Sunday games. And then even Friday, right? There's a game Friday. So a lot going on this week in the NFL world. Really excited to dive into it. We'll give everyone a little bit more time to join in. While we're waiting for people to join, just want you to know we will be doing a promotion. I'll actually put this up on the screen for everyone to see. For my first 100 subscribers, we are doing a giveaway to one subscriber for this portable Bluetooth speaker that can break into two separate speakers. You can take this anywhere you want to go. Really just bringing the vibes, good vibes, whether it's a cookout, the pool, a tailgate, whatever that might look like. Again, we're doing a giveaway to my first 100 subscribers. One of my lucky subscribers will win this really cool speaker. You can obviously subscribe right from the channel that you're on right now, or you can obviously use this QR code to get to to view my channel and subscribe from there. So do not forget to subscribe to this channel. Again, I am on my road to my first 100 subscribers. All subscriptions really help. Make sure to like, comment, tell me topics that you're looking for me to talk about, as well as, if there's any teams or players specifically that you're most excited to see as well. Like I said, we'll be getting started very shortly. While we're getting into this, any teams you're most excited to hear about in the AFC East, AFC South, AFC West, NFC South, NFC West? Any teams there you're most looking forward to? All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, excited to dive into today's topics. Again, first we'll be going over the AFC South. Next, after that, we'll be diving into the NFC South. Then we'll be going into the AFC West, and then, the NFC West, and then we'll be diving into the AFC West after that. So let's go ahead and get started. And might be diving into a team not everyone is most excited about, but we'll go ahead and dive into it regardless. And that would be the Indianapolis Colts, right? So first things first, when it comes to the Indianapolis Colts, last year starting out for them, or actually not even starting out, the entire year I would say was just ups and downs, right? And it was just the biggest, I would say, tale of the tape would be the inconsistency. And a lot of that comes with the fact that they really split time between two quarterbacks last year. It was Anthony Richardson and then Joe Flacco. And weren't able to make the playoffs in what I would consider to be the weakest division in the AFC. And there's a couple reasons for that. They did rank 13th in total offense, but the biggest factor for the Colts last year was actually their defense. Their defense, they ended up in the bottom four in total defense last year, and I think that might have actually had the biggest impact on this team. Not even talking about the quarterback situation, is the fact that they're giving up a lot of yardage on a consistent basis. That's a huge aspect of really what happened to them, is their defense was really struggling, and I think a big aspect of what they tried to improve on in this offseason was that defensive side. They brought in Travarius Ward, they brought in Cameron Bynum, right, to help out their secondary. They also brought in like a defensive tackle and Gallimore, and they even drafted another cornerback as well as a defensive end in this year's draft. Their biggest draft pick and their number one draft pick was Tyler Warren, the tight end, who they're expecting to be a huge weapon for Daniel Jones, who is slated to be the starter for the Indianapolis Colts this year. But they did lose, I think, some big players for themselves as well. The biggest loss, I think, for them was on their offensive line. They lost Ryan Kelly, a center, and they also lost their right guard, Will Freeze. From that perspective, they also did lose some players on defense. They lost Raekwon Davis, who's a defensive tackle, and then they also lost Julian Blackmon, their safety, right? Not sure if those are going to be as big of losses as what they could, what I could potentially see them being from that perspective. But again, the biggest thing I'm going to have to really talk about is the fact that going into the season, Anthony Richardson being, a top 4 pick in the draft, mind you, this was 3 years ago. He was competing with Daniel Jones, who was a top 10 pick in the draft like 5 or 6 years ago, actually. Everyone knows who Daniel Jones is, right? And, to me, the Colts brought Daniel Jones in as what I would call a security blanket. I don't think they were completely confident in what to expect out of Anthony Richardson going into this season, mostly because of injury. Anthony Richardson had a shoulder injury going into this season, and I think that was a big reason, or at least excuse, as to why they brought in Daniel Jones, was just unsure if Anthony Richardson would be ready. He was ready by training camp, which was, I think, a shock to most. But again, recently, I think this was 2 weeks ago now, they announced Daniel Jones as their starter. And, I talked about this before, but obviously going into the Colts this year, I need to dive in a little bit more on this. I don't really understand that decision, right? Daniel Jones is not going to be someone that, one, gets you to the playoffs. He did that once with the Giants, but I really think a lot of that had to come down to how good the Giants' defense was that year. They had a pretty formidable defense, and they also had Saquon Barkley that helped out a lot from an offensive perspective. Now, he is matched up with Taylor, right? They have a great running back in Jonathan Taylor, but they still have a little bit of an issue at the receiving core, in my perspective. I think it's pretty deep in the sense that they have a fair amount of solid receivers, but you have Michael Pittman, who had, in my opinion, an off year last year. I was expecting a lot more out of Michael Pittman last year. He had like 800, a little over 800 yards. Their top receiver last year was Alec Pierce. I think if you were to ask someone in 2 years, hey, who was the top receiver for the Indianapolis Colts in 2024, I don't think anyone would give you the response of Alec Pierce. He did have 7 touchdowns, but again, I think everyone was expecting a lot more from Michael Pittman. They're also expecting a lot more from Josh Downs and Adonai Mitchell, right? A.D. Mitchell out of Texas, who was one of their draft picks last year, to me didn't have nearly the season I expected. He was a playmaker at Texas. He was someone that had really good separation, but also solid hands, and found himself in the back of the end zone pretty regularly for the Texas Longhorns, and I really just didn't see that last year, right? He had 23 receptions for 312 yards and no touchdowns, right? that is not what you're looking for out of, I think he was actually an early, he was either a late first or he was a, it was a second round pick, right? He was the middle of the second round last year, again, out of Texas. And again, he just didn't have the type of season anyone expected him to have, considering the fact he had 11 touchdowns his last year at Texas. You just didn't see that translate. And he's a pretty solid, bodied wide receiver. He's 6'2", 205, and he also has the speed. So to me, I think a big thing that the Colts are probably hoping for and needing to be successful this year is balance in this offensive attack, because Jonathan Taylor, he's still pretty young. He had 1,400 yards last year. Is he going to be able to repeat that year after year after year? Is he the Derrick Henry type? I'm not 100% sure. I love the fact that he's out of Wisconsin. I think he has really good. Um, I think he has really good vision. First off, I think he has a really good eye for finding holes in the defense and executing. Right, his quickness and his speed, he then utilizes to get out and into the open field. But again, for the Colts, just straight up, I don't see them doing much better than third place in this division. And a huge aspect of that is obviously the fact that they just don't have the quarterback play, right? They also don't have the offensive weapons from a receiving perspective. This could change, but with that being said, it kind of just goes back to what I was saying before, is to why aren't you trying Anthony Richardson out, right? They talked about this in a press conference. They had the GM talking in a press conference, and he said, he's like, we knew it was going to take time with Anthony Richardson. We knew he was going to be a project. Why aren't you giving him the reps to work on it? Like, you're not playing for anything this year, in my opinion. You're not going to be a playoff team. You are not going to be a a team that is even as remotely close to contending for the Super Bowl. And I know that it doesn't mean like, hey, if you're not there, just flop and roll over and hope for a first round, a high first round pick. But at the same time, you invested a lot in Anthony Richardson, and you're saying like it's just going to take time. You're not even giving him the time to actually get better and improve and see if he is the quarterback of your future. They didn't trade him after announcing he wasn't going to start. So like the 2-2 just doesn't make sense to me, right? Like, do you think Daniel Jones is actually your quarterback, or do you just think that Anthony Richardson isn't the quarterback for right now, and so you need to give him time for whatever reason? I mean, he's had, this is his third year. He's had time, right? What are you actually waiting for? Like that's my biggest issue right now with the Colts. I'm not exactly sure what they're hoping is going to happen this year, and I'm not really sure what their plans are for Anthony Richardson. But it seems to me like they're not really banking on much coming from him this year. Because again, why not just give him the start? Why not just give him the opportunities? Because again, Daniel Jones will be there, and he's going to be the same Daniel Jones he has been. He's not going to change. He's been pretty consistent in the type of player he's been. And so again, for me, I see the Colts going 7-10 this season, and I think that is something they should be happy with given their quarterback situation, especially. Again, I have them being third, and we'll talk about the team next that I see being the team that ends up behind them in the AFC South. But yeah, that's really where I see the Colts going this year. Any thoughts on that? Does anyone think that the Colts will be better or worse? Going into the next team, and I alluded to the fact that this team I have sort of being in last place in the AFC South, but we'll talk about them regardless. It's the Tennessee Titans, and we talked about inconsistency at quarterback. The Titans were a good example of that last year, right? So they ended up 3-14 last year, which is obviously not a good record. It's how you become the first pick in the NFL draft. They tested out Will Levis, quarterback out of Kentucky, who they had gotten in the second round, and I think it was pretty clear after last year that Will Levis is not the answer. He would put themselves in decent situations, but then he would just throw the ball away. I think Will Levis was famous for I forget what they call it, but just doing like he ended so many plays like this, right? If I were to have a screenshot of Will Levis, it'd be like this or like this, right? That is really how Will Levis ended most drives for the Tennessee Titans last year. And a lot of times it was either because he threw an interception or he got sacked and fumbled the ball. That was those were the two main outcomes I felt like for Will Levis and the Tennessee Titans last year. Now, they did go out and obviously in the first round with the first pick drafted Cam Ward out of Miami, who I think is a solid quarterback, and we'll dive a little bit more into him. But they also invested in the offense in other ways, right? They added guard Kevin Zeitler. They got Dan Moore, another guard. They even got Tyler Lockett out of Seattle, who for me, I kind of saw him as sort of like a lifelong Seahawk guy. I never considered Tyler Lockett to ever be on any other team, but they did go out and get him. He's a little bit older. I think his career is sort of on the sunsetting side of things, but I think that's a pretty solid pickup for them. They also got some defensive players in Cody Barton, a linebacker, as well as Xavier Woods. But to me, the story of the main additions for this year is obviously Cam Ward, right? Because when you draft a QB number one overall, the expectations especially are what people are going to talk about the most. You are expected to save this franchise. You're expected to be a key contributor for the Titans, not just this year, but for years to come, right? They've been in a tough situation ever since Ryan Tannehill kind of, I would say, faded off into the sunset, right? Ryan Tannehill was a solid, serviceable, more than serviceable quarterback for the Titans, right? When they also had Derrick Henry, they also had AJ Brown, but those times are over, right? That was, that's like ancient history nowadays in Tennessee. And so, for me, the biggest concerns I have with them is the fact that, they're ranked bottom 8 in offense, but they were ranked second in defense last year, right? So they had a pretty solid defense, but their offense just could never get up and running. And I just don't know if Cam Ward is someone that is going to be an immediate big time quarterback in the NFL. I think he's had an amazing ride, right? How he ended up in Miami and then turned into a first round pick or first pick in the draft. From what I remember, I don't think he was highly recruited out of college. I think he was a 0-star quarterback, especially. And, he's continuously improved and he's continuously proved people wrong, right? I hope he proves me wrong, but I'm in a position where I got to give my take on him. And to me, my biggest concern, and there is a caveat to this, and I'll talk a little bit about this, but my biggest concern is it became very obvious to me when Shedeur Sanders slid that after Cam Ward, there wasn't really a lot of quarterback depth, right? There wasn't a lot of really solid quarterbacks in this draft. And the biggest way that you can really tell that is the fact that, after Cam Ward, it was like 20 picks before Jackson Dart came off the board, right? Generally in drafts, you see if you're a good quarterback, teams are going to take a shot at you, right? They're going to take a shot at you. And I know, again, Cam Ward was drafted first overall, but was he drafted first overall because he was that good or because the other quarterback options that they had out there weren't exactly a stellar option, right? And one again, I said I had a caveat. My caveat to this is the fact that I think Jackson Dart might end up being the best quarterback in this draft class. That's not saying Cam Ward won't be good, but to me, Jackson Dart was extremely impressive in the preseason. The guy just shows poise in the pocket, and he didn't make like a wrong decision. Like that was the other aspect of this. Now Cam Ward, he also showed poise in the pocket, and I think he showed he knew how to work his receivers and go through his progressions, right? That I think that's probably the biggest thing that Cam Ward showed me was the fact that he knows how to stay poised and work through his progressions. One of his biggest issues in preseason was the fact that his receivers were just dropping the ball left and right. Seemingly, we're doing well with other quarterbacks, though. I was watching that preseason game, and Van Jefferson, who had like a couple big drops, on Cam Ward passes, had ended up having like 100-yard plus receiving yards game in his third preseason game when Cam Ward didn't even play. Doesn't make sense to me, but again, thus here we are with Cam Ward, as the starting quarterback and not Brandon Allen. And again, I'm looking at this team. I'm really concerned about the options that Cam Ward has. I think that's going to be the biggest issue going into this season for the Tennessee Titans. Calvin Ridley, he sort of had an up and down career. He had a really stellar year his last year in Atlanta, and then he got banned from the NFL for a gambling issue. He had a pretty decent, I would say, stop in Jacksonville. But at the same time, like expecting Calvin Ridley to be your number one is a huge question mark for me. I think again he's a solid receiver, but is that the number one receiver that you want for a rookie quarterback, right? Is that like your safety blanket? To me, it's probably going to be Tyler Lockett. I think Tyler Lockett has to be that safety blanket for Cam Ward. Tyler Lockett to me is more so a big play guy. Maybe he's going to transition into more of that possession receiver this year with the Titans, but he is a guy that knows how to get open and he has pretty sure hands. So to me, Tyler Lockett's got to have to be that security blanket for Cam Ward, right? I think that's going to be a huge aspect of this. Um, Another thing I want to talk about with the Titans is the fact that their run game, right? Who do you really expect to be, a breakout rusher for the Titans, right? Because to me, you're looking at Tony Pollard to be your starting running back. He had 1,000-yard season last season. That was on 260 carries. One, he's getting older too. I've just never been a Tony Pollard believer. I think Tony Pollard saw success out of circumstance, especially in Dallas, because of the fact that they just kept banking on Ezekiel Elliott, and Ezekiel Elliott just fell off super fast. But I definitely don't expect Tony Pollard to take a huge weight off of Cam Ward's shoulders this year. I think he'll be a serviceable running back. If he gets 1,000 yards this year, that would be an accomplishment in my opinion. The one other thing I'd have to say that sort of makes this season a little bit more, I would say, um, palatable for Titans fans is the fact that they have the 29th easiest schedule. They have one of the easiest schedules and I think that's going to be the biggest impact for this quarterback, right? For Cam Ward. If you think of last year, one of the things that people don't necessarily talk about too much when it comes to Bo Nix is the fact that, and I'll talk more about this, but like Bo Nix had a pretty easy schedule. Other than the AFC West, if you look at the quarterbacks he went up against a lot of backup quarterbacks. And I think that proved to actually help Bo Nix and the Broncos a lot. And so the Titans having an easier schedule, I think is going to have the best impact on this Titans team of any of these factors that I've necessarily discussed. Because again, you are in a pretty weak division, right? But at the same time, you don't really have a lot of weapons. Again, Van Jefferson's their third wide receiver. And to me, Van Jefferson is someone on most rosters would be fighting for a spot, right? I do think that is sort of where Van Jefferson is in his career. And so again, I like Cam Ward. I don't think he's good enough though be a to be an organizational like franchise quarterback. I think he has the ability to be a top 15 quarterback in the NFL, right? I'll put him where I see Cam Ward going is sort of like Kyler Murray, right? So if you watch Kyler Murray throughout his career, he's shown a lot of promise. He's shown there's times where Kyler Murray looks like an MVP quarterback, but then there's also times where you're like, Kyler Murray should not be on this field right now. And to me, that's kind of where I expect to see Cam Ward, especially in his first couple seasons, and especially being with the Tennessee Titans. So for me, I see the Titans being dead last in this division this year. I know a lot of people have hopes for the Titans and for Cam Ward, but to me, I just don't see them being able to do enough to be even better than the Colts this year. And so for me, I actually have them going 6-11, right? That's sort of where I see the Tennessee Titans season going. Now, could they be 8-9? Sure, right? I think that's a possibility, but I'd have to see a lot out of Cam Ward in those first couple weeks for me to say that. To me, I think 6-11 is where they end up, and again, I see them being last in the division, and hopefully they find themselves in the spot where they're able to get another marquee player to help Cam Ward, preferably a wide receiver. Sadly for them, some of those best wide receivers are not going to be available in this year's draft, right? There's some stud receivers that are sophomores this year, but we'll go more into that later on in the season. Next team I want to talk about is the Jacksonville Jaguars. And the Jacksonville Jaguars definitely had what I would call an extremely disappointing season last season. If you want to talk about the year prior, they were actually contending for a playoff spot. I think they lost something like 4, 5, 6 games in a row to end the 2023 season. And that obviously just carried over into the 2024 season because they went 4-13 last season. And they had a terrible year after signing Trevor Lawrence to a huge deal, right? They paid Trevor Lawrence. They're expecting Trevor Lawrence to be a guy. They want to, when you pay a quarterback to be like the highest paid quarterback at that time, you're expecting him to be a top 5 quarterback in this league, right? Everyone say hi to Mags. Hi Mags. See you later. Oh, want to hang out? But anyway, when you pay someone like a Trevor Lawrence top dollar, like you're expecting him to be a Pro Bowl caliber quarterback, and they got the exact opposite. Now he only played in 10 games last year, but he just got over 2,000 yards in passing. He had 11 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. That is just that is worse numbers than Daniel Jones, right? That's worse numbers than Anthony Richardson. And all of this comes with getting a stud receiver last year like Brian Thomas Jr., right? Brian Thomas Jr. had over 1,200 yards receiving himself. And so the two just doesn't mix. Again, I know Trevor Lawrence didn't play the whole season, right? He played in 10 games. But if you have a receiver like a Brian Thomas who's getting 1,200 yards and you're ending up with that stat line as Trevor Lawrence, the two just don't mix. The other aspect of this is their defense was atrocious last year. And to me, I'm just not sure that they found the answers to make their defense any better, right? They did draft, Travis Hunter. And to me, they kind of look at Travis Hunter as, I would say, an answer for both the offensive and defensive side. But at the same time, like, I just keep thinking about this in my head. It's like, in college, I know he did it, and maybe this is just one of those situations where it's like, I haven't seen it, so I just don't believe it can happen. But in the NFL, I just really struggle to believe Travis Hunter can be effective on both sides of the ball, right? Just straight up, I do not understand or expect Travis Hunter to be a lockdown corner and then a solid I'll call him a wide receiver too, right? Because obviously Brian Thomas, I think, is a wide receiver 1. But I just don't know if Travis Hunter could be a lockdown corner and then also be a wide receiver 2, right? Think about this. Like, what happens? What happens if he was playing defense and then they're in a situation where they need to get a touchdown immediately after, right? Is he going to have the energy to go out there, run a solid route, and get a touchdown? And then vice versa. Let's say he just ran a go route on third down, or maybe they go for it on fourth down, they don't get it. Is Travis Hunter going to have to take a break before he comes into the game, right? Is he going to have to take a breather? You'd imagine he'd have to, right? There's going to be circumstances where I just don't know if Travis Hunter is going to be able to always be out there. And that's my biggest concern is this the fact that I think he's a great player. I think he's a generational talent. But at the same time, you just can't be everywhere, right? He's one person, and I know he's slotted to play both corner and wide receiver. But to me, like the biggest thing is I would keep him and focus him on corner, right? That I would focus him on the defensive side. If you already have a stud receiver like a Brian Thomas, and you have a decent running game with Tank Bigsby and Travis Etienne, like your defense needs more attention. Your defense needs more focus. I know they also got like Trey Flowers at corner as well, but to me, it's a no brainer to focus Travis Hunter on the defensive side because that's where your biggest issues were for Jacksonville. They did draft and bring in some solid players in my opinion. To me, they focused mostly on the offensive line when it came to free agency, right? They brought in a guard, a center, and another guard, right? They brought in Patrick McCary, Robert Hainsley, and then they also brought in Chuma Adugba. Might have messed up his name there, but that's really who they focused on from an offensive perspective was like the offensive line. And then they got the safety out of Tulane in the draft, and then really other than that, they got another guard, a running back. I just don't know if that's enough for their defense. And obviously, the biggest question is can Trevor Lawrence turn it around this year? He's got a lot of pressure to be productive this year. If Trevor Lawrence has another down year like he did last year, I don't know if they'll necessarily cut him or try to trade him, but I do think that this could potentially be a prove it year for Trevor Lawrence after the year he had this past year, right? Now, I say all this to say I do think they are going to bounce back a little bit, right? I know I've been pretty tough from a critic perspective on who the Jaguars are and were. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I think they extremely underperformed. I myself think that Trevor Lawrence is actually a solid quarterback. I think Trevor Lawrence could impact, the Jaguars in a positive light this year a lot more than what people are thinking. I think people have sort of written off Trevor Lawrence after the year he had last year. But to me, I see the Jaguars going 9-8 this season, right? And just because it's just such a weak division, I think that'll actually get them second place in the NFC South, right? I do see them missing the playoffs, but I think the Jacksonville Jaguars could potentially be second place in the AFC South this upcoming year, and a lot of that will have to do with Trevor Lawrence is going to bounce back, and I think Travis Hunter is going to be a lockdown corner for them. I think that's going to be a huge value for them. And again, if I'm them, I wouldn't focus him as much on the receiving side of things. I think their offense doesn't need Travis Hunter nearly as bad as their defense needs Travis Hunter. Next, I'm going to go into the Houston Texans. And, the Houston Texans, going into last year, I think were a team that everyone was like, oh, this is a Super Bowl contender. And, they went 10-7 last year and they made the playoffs. And they absolutely crushed the Chargers in the playoffs last year. But it was funny because everyone still kind of considered it a down year for C.J. Stroud. I think a lot of people going into last year thought C.J. Stroud was potentially going to be an MVP caliber quarterback, and that wasn't necessarily the case. To me, the biggest issue and the reason why C.J. Stroud had a down year was one, injuries, but also their offensive line was just a liability, right? And to kind of go into that a little bit more, they like half of the people they lost last year going into this year were offensive linemen. You're talking about Laramie Tunsil, Shaq Mason, Kenyon Green, right? Those offensive linemen are gone now, right? And I know Laramie Tunsil is a great tackle. Everyone speaks very highly of him. But at the same time, C.J. Stroud was sacked at an extremely high rate last year. A lot of times, people talk about second-year quarterbacks and going through, a sophomore slump. I don't know if he necessarily went through too much of a sophomore year slump, right? If you look at his stats, he threw for almost 4,000 yards. He had 3,700 yards. He had 20 touchdowns and 12 interceptions, right? So I wouldn't call that a stellar year by any means, right? That's not a Pro Bowl caliber season in my opinion, and it was a drop from his rookie season, right? He had 7 more interceptions his second year than he had his rookie season. Um, but at the same time, a lot of that had to do with injuries, right? Nico Collins was out for a considerable amount of time. Tank Dell was out for a considerable amount of time last year, right? They had to really heavily rely on Joe Mixon to be the guy for them last year, and from a receiving perspective, but then also, a rushing perspective mostly, right? He had over 1,000 yards, and he had like 300 yards receiving, and Tank Dell, Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs also. That the Stephon Diggs project didn't, or I'll call it experiment, right? The Stephon Diggs experiment did not work with the Houston Texans. I thought that was going to be a match made in heaven. I thought C.J. Stroud and Stephon Diggs were going to be a perfect match, and that did not work out. And so you had those 3 receivers, right, that were out and missed a lot of last season. Stephon Diggs only played 8 games. Nico Collins played 12, and then I think Tank Dell was like 14 games, so he missed 3 games. But there just wasn't the consistency, and some of that comes down to the fact that teams now have tape on C.J. Stroud. They understand what is his, I would say, his what he likes to do, right? How does he like to operate? What are the plays he likes to call? What are some signs he utilizes, right? There's just tape on him now. People can study CJ Stroud, and they weren't able to his rookie season to this level. And so I expect the Houston Texans to make a bigger jump this season from a overall performance perspective. I still think they're going to struggle um, on the offensive line side, right? A lot of people don't understand how much continuity you need on the offensive line to be successful. And so it scares me the fact that they have like a whole new offensive line starting for them this year. I think in the beginning of the season, you're going to see struggles, but I think they're going to pick it up towards, week 5, 6, or 7, right? I see the Texans sort of repeating what they did last year. I think they're going to end up 10-7, and I think they're going to be a playoff team. But again, my biggest concerns is the fact that they have a brand new offensive line, and then also what's happening with Joe Mixon, right? Joe Mixon has like an ankle injury that is essentially putting him on IR, from what I understand, and they're not exactly sure. Like, they haven't really been clear about what happened with him. It seems like it was an off the field injury. It was not related to training or anything along those lines. And so they're going to expect a lot of Nick Chubb. And I'm a big fan of Nick Chubb. I think the Browns letting go of Nick Chubb was a huge, huge problem for them. I think that was just like a perfect example of who the Cleveland Browns are as an organization, just making terrible decisions. But the Houston Texans picking him up, I think, is gonna essentially save them from being a non-playoff team. Like, having Nick Chubb, I think is the reason why they're going to be able to maintain this year and have a 10-7 record. So again, I do see them being the first team in the AFC South. Now, again, the obvious caveat to that is the fact that the AFC South is by far the weakest AFC division that there is. And so, again, I do see them being a playoff team. I don't know if I see them being a team that will make much noise in the playoffs, though, if I'm being honest. Moving over to the NFC South. Let's talk about the NFC South. And the first team I want to go into when it comes to the NFC South is actually the Carolina Panthers. Now, Carolina Panthers went 5-12 last year, and I the beginning of last season was a nightmare for the Carolina Panthers, right? Bryce Young started the season out, and I think it was either after 2 or 3 games, he was benched for Andy Dalton, right? A longtime veteran, but you're not expecting Andy Dalton to be the answer for you, right? He's a serviceable backup now at this point. But Bryce Young gets benched. Everyone in Carolina is saying this is the end of Bryce Young's tenure. They're already talking about how he was a bust, a flop. Again, getting cut or not getting cut, but getting benched for Andy Dalton was a huge shot to Bryce Young and his overall confidence. The one thing I will say is he turned it around, right? I think that's like the most impressive aspect of Bryce Young that I've seen is the fact that you could get benched after the Carolina Panthers traded up to get you, picked you first overall, and then you have a terrible beginning of your season, and again he just completely turned it around last season. The last 3 weeks of the season last year, he threw 7 touchdowns and no interceptions. Right, that is extremely impressive. I don't care who you are or what team you're on. If you were throwing 7 touchdowns and no interceptions in a 3-game span, that's a quarterback I want on my team. And so they have probably, in my opinion, the most uphill battle to climb when it comes to their defense. Right, their defense ranked last in the league, while their offense wasn't much better, right? They were fourth to last. But again, having the worst defense last year, you don't really set your team up for success. And the biggest thing I will say is they did go out and add defensive players in free agency, right? They got Tershawn Wharton, who's a defensive tackle. They got Trayvon Moehrig, who's a safety, Bobby Brown, another defensive tackle, and then Pat Jones, an outside linebacker. But is that enough, right? They drafted Nick Scorton, who's an edge rusher out of Texas A&M. If you're dead last, what can you really, in defense, what can you really expect from your team? And that's my biggest concern, is I think their offense is actually going to work a lot better this year. Like Dave Canales, I think there was concerns about Canales being the head coach last year. He's a young coach, but he did a great job in Tampa Bay. And seemingly at the beginning of the season, it looked like Canales' system and his game plan was an epic failure. Again, they turned it around though, and so for me, again, it's what can this defense do to help out Bryce Young in this offense? Because I love the pickup in the draft pick of Tet McMillan, right? To Tet McMillan out of Arizona, the wide receiver they took in the first round. I haven't heard anyone say anything bad about Tet McMillan, whether it's the media, coaches, players. Like no one has said anything bad about Tet McMillan. Everyone's saying he is the most surefire like wide receiver one for this team, and they expect him to have a huge rookie season. Now, my experience in life tells me that this means he's going to have the worst season, right, in the NFL in his rookie season, because most of the time most people don't know what they're talking about. But for the sake of what I'm talking about today, I actually believe he will be that type of player. The other thing I'll say about this and why I like Tet McMillan is he's a big-bodied receiver. Like Bryce Young's small. Bryce Young struggles to see over that offensive line, and so having a big target like a Tet McMillan is going to be a huge advantage for him because without even having to, he's going to be able to see him down the field, right? It's going to be so much easier for Bryce Young to identify an open receiver when you have a big-bodied receiver like that. On the other hand, I will say I do not like the fact that they let Adam Thielen go back to Minnesota. I think that was a big mistake. Adam Thielen was their leading receiver last year. Their second leading receiver is on IR, right? Jalen Coker. I would have felt better about letting Adam Thielen walk if Jalen Coker was healthy. But to me, losing Thielen, I think, is going to have more of an impact on this offense than people realize. Now, again, they did get Tet McMillan, so I will say those sort of even each other out, if anything, maybe more so on the positive side, because Tet McMillan is going to be more of an impact player than Adam Thielen is. But they had the ability to have Tet McMillan. They had the ability to have Xavier Legette, and then also Adam Thielen out there all at the same time. Like, that would be a pretty lethal 3 wide receiver combo, right? Having Adam Thielen as wide receiver 3 is so much more advantageous than having Adam Thielen being your wide receiver 1, and that's what he was going in last year for them. And so having Tetiora McMillan and then Xavier Legette hopefully step up this year, that would have been that would have been a really good wide receiver trio right there. I really could have seen that wide receiver core doing some numbers this year, and so I don't understand that aspect. And so for me, I really see the Panthers getting 3rd place in this division, and I see them improving. But I see them ending up with like a 7-10 record, right? They're not going to make the playoffs, but I do think they're going to see a little bit of an improvement, and I think they're going to have more confidence in not only Canales but also Bryce Young, going into next year. And I do think this will end up being a year that they can build on. Next, let's talk about the New Orleans Saints. Now, just right off the bat, I'm not going to talk too much about the New Orleans Saints because, to me, one, they're just such a bad team. Like, I think this is going to be the worst team in the NFL this year, just straight up. They ended last season at 5-12, and it didn't really make a lot of sense from an offensive perspective. They were sort of middle of the pack from offense. Defense, they really struggled. They were 3rd to last. And to me, they only got worse by, the retirement of Tyrann Mathieu, letting Paulson Adebo leave, right? They did bring in a new head coach, Kellen Moore, who, to me, he was the offensive coordinator for the Eagles. But to me, I'm not sure he's the type of guy that you need as a head coach in the NFL yet. I'm not sure if he's ready. And number one example of that was the fact that up until like last week, they didn't know who their starting quarterback was going to be, right? They drafted Tyler Shuck in the 2nd round, and then they also had 4th rounder from the year prior, Spencer Rattler, competing for the starting role. And the fact that they just like kept that quarterback competition going, like, to me, was just like a perfect example of the fact that how bad this team is going to be. Like, I'm putting it on Kellen Moore a little bit, and maybe unfairly, but like, just pick one of those quarterbacks. It doesn't matter. You're going to be in last place in this division, and you're going to be the worst team in the NFL. Like, you will be happy if you won. Like, if they won 5 games this year, that would be the biggest, I would say, like, overachieving team in the NFL. Like, I truly think that they won't win more than 3 games this year. I really do see them going 3-14 and being dead last in the NFC South. And again, a lot of that has to do with the fact that they have 2 terrible quarterbacks to choose from. I feel terrible for, I really do feel terrible for their running back, Alvin Kamara. Like, Alvin Kamara, he is such a consistent running back, but he's 30 years old. I just don't see him being able to carry the load for the Saints. Chris Olave, I think, is solid, but he's seemingly always injured. So, again, I just don't know what the Saints can do to have any sort of positive outcomes from this season. Right? They even brought back Brandon Cooks, who, like, Brandon Cooks to me is like one of those guys that's like, how are you still in this league? Like, he produces, right? I'm not saying he's a bad wide receiver, but he's one of those guys that, like, I'm like, how are you still around? Like, how do you still make like an impact year after year? He's sort of like an anomaly for me. I think we're starting to finally see the end of that, right? His last really good year was in 2021. And again, that just kind of talks a little bit about what I'm talking about. Like, he had 259 yards last year with the Cowboys. Like, why is he your wide receiver 2? What are you hoping to get out of this 31-year-old running wide receiver? Sorry, like I don't understand that, and I think that's like a perfect example of like where the Saints are. I'm not going to waste any more time on the New Orleans Saints. I apologize for talking about them as long as I had, but again, I see them going 3-14 and being dead last in the NFC South. Next, here's a team with complete opposite side of the spectrum. Not from like I expect them to be amazing, but just overall the narrative around this team I find super interesting. And I'm talking about the Atlanta Falcons. So the Atlanta Falcons went 8-9 last year, and they missed the playoffs after having like a really solid start to the season, but really dropped off at the end of last season. And a big reason for that was like the performance of Kirk Cousins. Like Kirk Cousins started out the season pretty well, I think better than what people thought, but he just really fell off. I think he was dealing with some injuries, but they handed the keys over to Michael Penix with like 3 or 4 games of last year. I think the fourth game of last year is where Michael Penix really took over for Kirk Cousins. And here's what I'm saying, and call me crazy. Maybe I'm being a little bit of a pessimist here, but Michael Penix to me wasn't like overly impressive at the end of last season. For me, I was looking at what he accomplished. He had 775 yards in 5 games, but he threw 3 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. And again, those aren't like amazing numbers. Like that is not extremely impressive numbers. And to me, again, I just don't understand why are people so high on the Falcons. It's kind of I think there's like this saga, and like I'll kind of compare it to like a player they have on their team. Like every single year, people talk about Kyle Pitts, and Kyle Pitts is going to have this breakout year, and Kyle Pitts this, Kyle Pitts that, right? It's the same thing from the Falcons' perspective, just overall as a team, in my opinion. And a big aspect of that, I think, is the fact that Bijan Robinson did arrive last year, right? Bijan Robinson probably showed the most hope out of any of them, any player that the Falcons had. He almost had 1,500 yards rushing, and he was close to 500 yards receiving, right? That's he had like 18 touchdowns total last year, and again, a big aspect of that. Sorry, he had like 15 touchdowns, but like so I know that they're expecting a lot out of Bijan Robinson, and they think that he's going to be the guy. But like again, going into this season, like I don't understand why Michael Penix didn't play in a preseason game. The only reason I can really come up with is the fact that he's had some serious injuries. Like he is technically an older second-year quarterback. He's 25 years old, and he's had some serious like knee issues, right? He's had. Sorry guys, I think my dog is puking. Um, he's had some serious knee issues that he dealt with like in Indiana especially before he transferred to Washington. But like I don't understand what they expected out of Michael Penix this year. Like to be the guy that they just didn't give any sort of preseason reps to. It didn't make any sense to me. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but a couple things I do want to also mention is like I felt like they did a pretty good job in the draft. They focused on the edge. They got Jalen Walker and then James Pierce very early on, who are 2 big edge rushers, and then they also got Xavier Watts, who's a safety out of Notre Dame. Right, I like those 3 players that they drafted. So I think those are going to help out from like a defensive perspective a lot more than people realize. They didn't do much else in free agency. Like they brought Azeez Ojulari, who's a linebacker. They also brought they brought in AJ Dillon. Sorry, that's actually incorrect. They brought in Leonard Floyd. That's who I meant to say. They brought in Leonard Floyd, that defensive edge. But again, from an offensive perspective, the other thing that really has me worried is the fact that they had 2 major injuries before the season even started. They've lost 2 tackles already to injury, and we're not even sure when they're going to be back. right? That's like a big aspect of this is, Caleb McGarry, right? And then Storm Norton. Those are two tackles that are on IR right now. They also have Tyrone Wheatley, who's another tackle that's on IR. So if Jake Matthews get injured, they have Jack Nelson to be a swing tackle, right? That is not good for a rookie. No, I'm calling him a rookie quarterback, a second-year quarterback, right? Michael Penix having those sorts of issues on your offensive line does not give me or him probably a lot of comfort going into this season. And again, the other aspect of this is like, and I brought this up earlier, but Michael Penix, he's been talking a lot about Kyle Pitts. I feel like Michael Penix is like the main driver of like, let's restart this Kyle Pitts hype. The Kyle Pitts hype, I'm over it, right? That's something that I decided like last year. I was like, I'm done falling into this trap. I'm done being excited about this freak of nature style tight end that just seemingly underperforms year after year after year, right? To dive in a little bit into what that actually looks like from a stats perspective, his best year was definitely his rookie season. He had over 1,000 yards. And then he's had a 400-yard season and then two 600-yard seasons since then, right? His numbers have dropped essentially every single year besides his second year he was injured, right? But again, Michael Penix in his first like press conference in training camp was like, see me throw the ball to Kyle Pitts, it's going to happen a lot this year, right? Like he was essentially saying like Kyle Pitts is going to be a big target for me all year this year. And to me it's like why are you putting this on Kyle Pitts? Like I'm sure Kyle Pitts was like, dude, don't do this. Right? Because he's had this disappointment year after year. The fans have gotten over this Kyle Pitts is the guy thing, and Michael Penix is pushing us even further. So like to me, it's like the biggest question you have to ask yourself is Michael Penix the guy? I'll be honest, I do not think Michael Penix is nearly as good as what people are explaining him to be. I think he's going to be a good quarterback in the NFL. I don't know how long he'll be a good quarterback, though. His injury history really scares me. I think he's a great leader, and I think he has a lot of talent. But I think you're talking about a player with some serious knee injuries that is behind an offensive line that is generally solid, but is dealing with some scary injuries as well. And so for me, I see the Falcons staying second in the NFC South, but I see their record improving to 9-8. Again, a lot of this is just the fact that I'm not sold on Michael Penix. I think there's a lot of people thinking Penix and the Falcons will compete with the Buccaneers this year, but to me, I just don't see that being the case. I think this is the Buccaneers' division to lose, in my opinion. And so we'll go into them now, right? The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they went 10-7 last year, and they made the playoffs. Most people didn't expect that, though. I think this is such like a cool story. This is such a I love what happened with the Bucs last year, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that no one really expected Baker Mayfield to do anything last year. I think they saw Baker Mayfield as a placeholder until they found another quarterback, whether that's through free agency or through the draft. But their offense was electric. They were third in the NFL in passing, and then they were third in the NFL in running. Like talk about balance, right? They were constantly moving the ball. I had Baker Mayfield on my fantasy league. Did not expect to start him regularly, right? I have Patrick Mahomes and Jordan Love as my other quarterbacks. I saw myself starting Baker Mayfield over either one of those quarterbacks. Pick them. I had Baker Mayfield generally starting over either one of them, and I don't even think that's going to be. I don't think that's going to change this year. A lot of people are super high on those quarterbacks. I think Baker Mayfield could potentially lead the league in passing again, right? They added Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State. I love that receiver. I think that's going to be a huge addition to this team, and it couldn't be better timing. Like Mike Evans, he's probably the most underrated wide receiver in NFL history, in my opinion. Like I'm saying NFL history. If you were to say most underrated wide receiver ever, It's Mike Evans. The guy is so consistent and he's so impressive. I expect nothing more from him to have. I think Mike Evans will still have another 1,000 yard season, but I think Emeka Ibuka will step in as the number two. Right, Chris Godwin, another great receiver. I don't think he's gonna like fall off necessarily, but at the same time, I just see Emeka Ibuka as such an impressive wide receiver. He knows how to get open. He knows how to get the ball, like how to get the ball at its highest point, and he's got great hands. Right? Again, Emeka Ibuka to me was such a great draft pick for this team. You know, they did lose some players, right? They lost Shaquille Barrett, they lost Robert Hainsey, they lost KJ Britt, right? They lost some of their linebackers. But at the same time, you know, they did bring in David Walker, who's an edge rusher. I just see this Buccaneers team being even better than they were last year. I'll say that without a doubt. The Buccaneers will be better than they were last year. I see them going 11-6 and making the playoffs. Um, I think this offense is just going to be so powerful. It's going to be, I think they're going to be a more balanced version of the Cincinnati Bengals. I think that's the best way to describe who the Buccaneers are. Is I think they're going to be a more balanced version of of the Cincinnati Bengals. I think that they can make a splash in the playoffs, and to me, I think they might be able to be someone that could surprise someone and bring maybe one of those top NFC contenders down in the playoffs this year. That's how high I am on the Buccaneers this year. All right, we got a couple more divisions left, so we'll keep going through them. Next up, and again, this team I will not spend as much time on, and that would be the Arizona Cardinals, right? So we're moving over to the NFC West, and you know the Cardinals. Here's my thing with the Cardinals. You know, every year, and I think it's kind of stopped recently, but every year people are high on Kyler Murray. I don't think people are there anymore. I think Kyler Murray has sort of seen his peak when it comes to what he's able to accomplish, right? I don't think people are expecting an MVP caliber Kyler Murray anymore. You know, I will say Trey McBride, the tight end, that was probably one of the biggest surprises and best surprises for this team, right? I think Trey McBride as at tight end it was a huge surprise. I still don't even think about him a lot. And I think a lot of the times I don't think about him is because of the fact that to me the Cardinals are such like just like an obsolete team. Like they're a non-factor. And that's like a big issue I have with them is I feel like they're like that pretty much year after year, right? They haven't had a season where people need to pay attention to the Cardinals, right? You haven't had to pay attention to the Cardinals in probably 4 years, 5 years, maybe even more. You know, I will say I do like some of their draft picks, like Will Johnson, the cornerback out of Michigan. I think that was like a huge addition. You know, Walter Nolan, the defensive tackle, right? I think they're making some good decisions now. I think a lot of this will come down to like, is Marvin Harrison going to take the next step though? I think that's the thing I'm probably most interested and curious to see out of the Cardinals this year is could Marvin Harrison actually become a marquee wide receiver in the NFL? Everyone's talking about, you know, how much size he's added, how much strength he's added in the offseason. Like they showed all these pictures of him from last year and this year. Like he definitely bulked up. And that's great, but you know, are you going to turn that into touchdowns and receptions? Right? That's going to be a huge aspect to this because again, you got beat out at the receiving side by a tight end, right? Trey McBride got 300 more receiving yards than you in your rookie season. Now, he did have like 885 yards, but given where they expected Marvin Harrison to be and what he ended up with, like I would consider that to be a little bit more of a disappointing year. What I'll say, you know, I've said all this, and I'll get into this a little bit more. This might be a shocking take to most, but I actually have the Cardinals ending up third place in the NFC West. And a big reason for that is actually when I'll go into next, like I'll go into the next team. but I expect them to be somewhere around 6-11, 7-10. Right? I'll say 7-10 is where I expect the Cardinals to end up. I do like the addition of Josh Sweat. I think that's going to help out their defense as well. But again, I just consider them a non-factor. Right? I know it sounds like I'm probably hating on them a lot based off of what I said prior, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that I feel like they had these expectations and they just haven't lived up to a single one of them. And I see consistency as their biggest issue. It's like there's no reason why I ever have to pay attention to the Cardinals. And there really isn't, ever. And so hopefully they actually make me pay attention to them this year. That is my marker for like if you're a good team is like, do I have to pay attention to? Is there something about you that I'm considering when it comes to the playoffs? And I just haven't been there with the Cardinals in several years now. Now, this might be my most interesting take. This might be my most interesting prediction. Maybe I should have talked about this sooner, but to me, I'm going to dive into the 49ers. And, the 49ers ended last season at 4-11, and they were plagued with injuries, right? So I'll say that in fairness. Like, Christian McCaffrey had an injury, Brandon Ayuk had a major injury. But to me, like Purdy had like a really tough season. I'll say these numbers, and you're like, wait, didn't I just hear these numbers before? Like Brock Purdy threw like 20 touchdowns and like 12 interceptions. So like hit similar numbers to what Trevor Lawrence hit, right? That's why I wanted to bring that up. Is that's really where he was. That's like similar numbers to like where C.J. Stroud was as well. Now, they were top 10 in total offense and defense, and still they got last place in the NFC West. I don't really understand how that is possible, but being a top 10 offensive and defensive team in the NFL, but then getting last place in the NFC West is a huge sort of like that's just, it doesn't make sense to me, right? Like I don't know how else to say it besides like make that make sense. And what I came to realize was like the fact that like their offense was getting the yards, but then they weren't capitalizing and scoring, right? The 49ers would bring the ball down, and either they would get stopped or they would turn the ball over. And then their defense was just finding themselves in terrible positions, right? And to me, that is such like a recipe for disaster. Is your offense not scoring points and your defense giving up the most points in the NFL, right? Like that is a crazy aspect of this. Is like they were 14th in points while their defense was fifth. They gave up the fifth most points, right? So imagine being a top 10 defense but giving up the fifth most points in the NFL. That is crazy. And again, the only way that can ever make sense is if their defense was constantly found in bad positions based off of field position, right? You're turning the ball over or you're getting stopped somewhere. And they let players like Deebo Samuel leave, who I think was kind of like the engine that could for the 49ers. I think Deebo Samuel was their Swiss Army knife, especially when they don't have CMC out there. And then again, also Brandon Ayuk being injured. So like that's a huge loss for the 49ers. And again, they're not expecting to see Brandon Ayuk until at least week 6. And again, I know that people are excited about the 49ers this year, and I'll be honest, I don't really understand why. Everyone's expecting them to have this bounce back season, and I'm like looking through everything. I'm like doing all this research. I'm like, they let go of Dre Greenlaw, like Hufanga, Charvarius Ward on defense. Like those are huge defensive players for them that they lost in free agency. And like they didn't pick up anyone I'm overly excited about. So like, what are people actually excited about? I think people are just like, oh, the injuries are gone. Like they're just gonna be better, right? Like they don't have injuries. So it's like, one, they still do have injuries. Here's like probably the craziest stat I was looking at when it comes to the 49ers. Their wide receiving core right now, they only have one wide receiver on their depth chart that doesn't have an injury, and that's Ricky Pearsall, right? They have one player on their depth chart that doesn't have an injury designation, and it's Ricky Pearsall, their second-year wide receiver, who had injuries last year. But if you look at this, Russell Gage, Jordan Watkins, Juwan Jennings, Brandon Ayuk, right? Demarcus Robinson is suspended, right? You literally have Ricky Pearsall as the only one that is not listed at questionable or out on this receiving corps. Sorry, Sky Moore. I can't believe I forgot about Sky Moore. Sky Moore is healthy. Cool. Like, what is that going to do, right? So you're putting all this on Christian McCaffrey, who seemingly had this like a scary potential Achilles injury last year. He didn't play to essentially avoid that injury. So we'll see where he is. You have George Kittle, who I think is a great tight end, a great leader, a great locker room guy. So you're putting all this on Brock Purdy, Christian McCaffrey, and George Kittle essentially. Because I don't know what to expect out of Ricky Pearsall. I haven't heard anyone being overly excited about him. Right? He didn't play a lot in the preseason because he was also dealing with injuries. Right? He had some tough soft tissue injuries that was keeping him out of preseason games. You have a Trent Williams at tackle who, I mean, at some point you gotta see him starting to fall, right? The guy's 37 years old. He's getting paid an astronomical amount of money, but he's 37 years old. At a certain point, he's gonna fall off. I don't know if it's gonna be this year, but at the same time, you're banking on a lot of these players to produce a lot for this team that I don't think is gonna happen. I'm gonna be honest. A lot of people have the San Francisco 49ers as a playoff team. I think with a healthy CMC, the best they will do is 7-10. I have them really being around 5-12, 6-11 this season. That is, I think they're going to be last place in the NFC West again. And I don't understand and see why people think that they're going to have a much better season this season. They let so many key players go, and they still have the injury issues. There's nothing that's been solved. Like, people go, oh, it's the new year, 49ers are going to be good again. It's like, look at the actual information. Like, read a book, right? Like, seriously, because to me, I'm looking at this team, I'm like, I don't see them being any better than last year. If anything, they'll be worse. Because, like, Deebo Samuel's not there. So, again, I have Deebo Samuel-less 49ers. I have the 49ers going 6-11, potentially even 5-12 this year. That leads me into the Los Angeles Rams. Now, the Los Angeles Rams, they went 10-7 last year. They won their division, and to me, like, I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that they had a lot of surprising production from their young defense. And I'm not saying surprising in the sense like they're not going to be good ever, but I don't think people expected, the Verse and Fisk addition, right? Braden Fisk and Jared Verse to be as impactful as they were in their rookie seasons. But like, to me, like, their defense was sort of middle of the pack otherwise. And, they're middle of the pack when it comes to, like, points allowed, right? I think they gave, like, the 17th most points, but they give up, like, the 26th most yards, right? So they're sort of middle of the pack. My biggest issue and my biggest concern with the Rams, and I've talked about this before, is Matt Stafford. The Rams are another team where people are like, oh, this could be a Super Bowl contending team. This could be, like one of the best teams in the NFL this year. And I do think they could be that if Matt Stafford didn't have his back injury that he's dealing with. I think that's going to be the biggest downfall for this team. And really their entire team rides on Matt Stafford's back and whether or not he's healthy or not. Because he missed most of this preseason, having as much as like an epidural in his back in order to deal with the pain. And I just don't trust it. Like, I really don't trust Matt Stafford's back. Now, beyond that, I don't trust Jimmy Garoppolo. Right? Jimmy Garoppolo, to me, is I don't understand why he's still in the NFL. Like, I think he's really there because he had like one solid season in the NFL. Other than that, he's been pretty much a disappointment year after year after year. He's never outperformed expectations besides like 1 year. And they brought in Devontae Adams, who is getting older. I think he's still a great wide receiver. Don't get me wrong. I think Devontae Adams is a game changer. But if you don't have Matt Stafford throwing the ball, I don't think he is a game changer, right? He's sort of proven that, right? Devontae Adams, he hasn't necessarily been talked about, like, besides, like, when was the last time someone was like, oh yeah, Devontae Adams, huge impact on the season, on the year? It has to be when he was with the Packers, right? He underperformed with the Raiders. He had issues with Aaron Rodgers and the Jets, right? He was never like a dominant receiver there. He would make big plays, but I would never be like, oh, Devontae Adams was a game changer. They won that game because of Devontae Adams, right? Like, that just didn't happen. And so for me, like, he goes as far as Matt Stafford's back goes, and like that's really the truth of it when it comes to how I feel about the Rams. I see them going 9-8, and again, I think this team, if they do well, it's going to be carried on the young defensive talent and not on Matt Stafford. I think that is why they would be better than 9-8, is if their defense continues to surprise and impress. Because again, I just don't see Matt Stafford lasting the entire season. You're a 37-year-old quarterback that has so many bumps and bruises and dings, and a back injury just like lingers. Like, at this age, when your back is sore, when your back is stiff, like, it just stays. I just don't have the confidence in that for Matt Stafford. So that's why I have Matt Stafford and the Rams going 9-8 and ending up second place in the AFC, or sorry, the NFC West. Right. This next team, we're going to talk about the Seattle Seahawks, who I'm actually pretty high on. And it's a little surprising, right? I'm like looking at this team and I'm reviewing the changes they made. And, for me, one, I'll just let you know, like, I'm a big Mike Macdonald fan. I think he's a great head coach. I loved him as a defensive coordinator for Baltimore. They, to me, like, I think they've done nothing but like make smart decisions, right? They focused on finding like their first pick in the draft was like an offensive lineman, right? They got Gray Zabel, right? They picked up Sam Darnold in free agency. They picked up an awesome safety, in my opinion, out of USC. Nick Emenwari, like, I'm a huge fan of that guy. I think he could potentially be a game changer. I just think that they made all really good decisions. They let some major people walk, though, right? And I think that's the reason why people aren't talking about the Seahawks nearly as much, right? They let Geno Smith walk, DK Metcalf. I've already talked about Tyler Lockett, right? Like, they let some of their offensive linemen walk as well, like Lincoln Tomlinson, George Fant, Stone Forsythe, right? They've lost some offensive linemen. But they also brought in some solid players. Again, I already mentioned Sam Darnold. But they also brought in offensive tackle Josh Jones. They brought in Ernest Jones, the linebacker. And then even DeMarcus Lawrence, right? They brought in DeMarcus Lawrence at the defensive end side. And, again, I just see Mike McDaniel. He's such like an analytical guy. He reminds me so much of like Mike McDonald to me would be like the person that would be perfect for that movie Moneyball, right? I just see Mike McDonald being that style of guy that just is so analytical. He's gonna let people walk that you kind of be like, huh? Like, why'd you do that? Like, you brought in Sam Darnold, but then you let your top receivers leave. What I'll say is, I think Jackson Smith and Jigba is a top receiver in this league. I think Jackson Smith and Jigba is gonna have a huge year for the Seattle Seahawks. I think that's a huge reason why they felt confident in letting Lockett and DK Metcalf leave is because I think they expect so much out of Jackson Smith and Jigba. I think he's going to be a huge reason why Sam Darnold is going to have a repeat season. And I think, again, that's probably the biggest question mark people have, right? Because Sam Darnold was essentially a journeyman and still is technically, right? He had an amazing year in Minnesota. And I think because of that amazing year in Minnesota, people were like, oh, like he's going to stick around. He'll probably get a new contract. He didn't get that new contract with them. He ends up signing with Seattle. And so now everyone's just kind of sitting, waiting, going like, before I make a bold prediction, before I feel confident in them, I need to see Sam Darnold in this offense. I need to see how they work together, right? But that's a very fair take, right? And we'll talk about it again in a similar situation with Geno Smith with the Las Vegas Raiders. But to me, a lot of people, and I even wondered it, like, is it just Kevin O'Connell's system? Is that what made him work? Is that what made Darnold figure it out? Like, to me, I don't think so. I think it was just he was actually in a good organization, right? Sam Darnold wasn't in a good organization until he went to Seattle, right? He had a brief stint with the 49ers, but he wasn't necessarily playing. Like, he wasn't playing. So, like, he was in Carolina, he was in with the Jets, and then briefly with the 49ers, and then he was with the Vikings. Vikings, great organization. They run an actual system. Like, they are a program in a sense, right? Not comparing it to like college programs, but like they run essentially a program. They develop players. They draft and develop players. And so for me, Darnold going over to Seattle was a great place for Darnold to go because I think that's a system that he can actually thrive in because you have someone like a Mike McDonald who is setting this team up for success. He's laying like brick by brick. You can kind of see it from a defensive side and of offensive side. He's making the right moves in order to make this a very scary team. And that's why I have the Seahawks being first in this division. I actually have the Seahawks going 11-6 this year. I think they're going to surprise a lot of people. It won't surprise me again, but I think Sam Darnold is going to have another year where he's going to impress people, and teams like the Jets, teams like the Panthers, teams like the Vikings are going to regret letting him walk. I think this is going to be a year where Sam Darnold says, like, hey, I'm here to stay, right? You need to respect me as a quarterback, and Jackson Smith-Njigba is going to be a huge part of that. Moving over to the AFC West, the last division we're going to go over today. So I know we've been going through a lot, but let's go through the last division, and I'll talk about the Las Vegas Raiders first. So the Raiders, first off, they went 14-13 to end the last season. They also started 3 quarterbacks last year. I think that's like a huge tale as to where the Raiders were last year. They started Aiden O'Connell, Gardner Minshew, and Desmond Ridder at starting quarterback last year. So that is like a perfect example. They also had Antonio Pierce as their head coach, and I know players loved him, right? I think Max Crosby was the first to say, like, if you let Antonio Pierce walk after his first year, right, where he stepped in, he was like an interim head coach. Like, they're like, if you let Antonio Pierce walk, like, I leave. Like, he had just like all the players behind him. That all disappeared, right? They had a terrible year this past year, but the Raiders brought in Pete Carroll as their head coach, and Pete Carroll brought Geno Smith with him from Seattle, right? They made like that's like such like let's just talk about that real fast because like to me that's like such like a surprising situation. Like, did you ever think there was gonna be a situation in the NFL where a coach was like, "Hey, I'm going to a new team and I'm bringing Geno Smith with me," right? Like that's such like a crazy thought, but like Geno Smith kind of earned it in a sense, right? Like part of it is like, hey, that they let him leave, but at the same time, like Geno Smith is sticking with Pete Carroll, and Pete Carroll sticking with Geno Smith. They did draft Ashton Jeanty, and I think that's like the biggest talk around this Las Vegas Raiders team is the fact that they do have Ashton Jeanty, right? Like I think he's going to be a great running back in the NFL. Everything I'm seeing from him, like he has every piece of him. Like I keep trying to even think of like a player he reminds me of, and like there's one like he reminds me of Barber, right? Barber for the Cowboys, Marion Barber. That's his name. He reminds me of Marion Barber. Like that's like the type of running back style I see from Ashton Jeanty, and I think he's gonna be a great receiver for them. I don't know how I feel about the Amari Cooper pickup. I think Amari Cooper has seen his days, right? I really think their offense is going to revolve around Ashton Genty and Brock Bowers, right? Brock Bowers, he's an amazing tight end, right? I talked about tight ends a little bit like on my previous episode. Like to me, Dalton Kincaid is probably actually the best tight end in this league, but it's a close second for Brock Bowers. Like I think Brock Bowers could potentially become the best. I still have Kincaid as my favorite, but like Brock Bowers will be this offense along with Ashton Genty, and I think this team will actually improve a lot more than what people expect from them. And a big aspect of that will be those players. I expect the Raiders to go 6-11 this year, right? I think they're going to end up being in last place in the AFC West, but I see them picking up a couple games in the win column this year and showing promise going into next year, right? I think that's going to be a big aspect of this is what Pete Carroll builds with this team. You know, do they stick with Geno Smith at quarterback? We'll have to see, but I do think that's going to be an interesting part of it. Now, next team I want to talk about is the Denver Broncos. The Denver Broncos went 10-7 last year, and they lost in their divisional round to the Bills. But they actually surprised a lot of people last year, and so this year is much more of a year of expectations, right? Sean Payton, everyone is now expecting Sean Payton to bring this team potentially even to a Super Bowl. I've heard as much of people saying that the Denver Broncos could be a Super Bowl team this year. And to me, like I think there's a potential for that. I don't have them there. Bo Nix, he really came on at the end of last year, and to me, they also made some solid additions, right? Like they brought in Evan Ingram, they brought in Dre Greenlaw, Hufanga, who I mentioned before, and they also got a running back in J.K. Dobbins, and they even drafted one in R.J. Harvey. Right? I think they made some pretty solid adds to this team. But to me, like the biggest story for me when it comes to the Broncos is the fact that like they won the games they won, like they should have won, but they also lost the games they should have lost. Like they didn't actually go out there and impress me against like a really good team. Like I never saw the Broncos last year and said like, oh wow, like look what they did to Mahomes. It just didn't. That didn't happen. And so this is such a tough division, and I think that's going to be the biggest downfall for me for the Broncos. Again, they didn't overperform or outperform, in my opinion, in any regard. And so for me, it comes down to the fact of like you have to play Patrick Mahomes twice a year. You have to play against Justin Herbert twice a year, right? On top of like the other divisions you end up playing against. I just don't see the Broncos being able to make the next jump this year. I think that again they'll carry like a good record, but I see them ending 10-7 again this year. I don't think they're going to improve from a record perspective. I think they'll improve as a team, but I think just purely because of the division they're in, they'll end up at 10-7 again this year. And they'll be looking at the playoffs, but they'll be on the outside looking in. I see them being third in the AFC West. I truly do. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I see the Los Angeles Chargers being one of the top teams this year, right? They went 11-6 last year, and they made it to the playoffs, and they got blown out by the Texans. But to me, I felt like they did a good job of bringing in like Mekhi Becton at guard. I love the fact that they re-signed Rashawn Slater. Obviously, that really scares me that Rashawn Slater is out. I think that's going to be the biggest question mark for the Chargers is what happens with this offensive line. Because remember, they have Joe Alt, right? They drafted Joe Alt out of Notre Dame, and they had Joe Alt move over to right tackle because they already had Rashawn Slater at left tackle. So Joe Alt played right tackle last year in his rookie season, and he did well with it. But now, instead of just finding another left tackle, they're moving Joe Alt to left tackle. And so they're essentially having to replace both tackle positions in a way. Instead of just replacing the left tackle position with a different left tackle, they're moving Joe Alt from right tackle to left tackle. So you're actually making two changes in a sense. And that part scares me, especially being, again, in such a tough division. I do love the running back that they drafted, Amarian Hampton, out of UNC. Like I think that's going to be a good pickup for them. I'm not worried at all about their receiving core. Like Lad McConkey, Keenan Allen, they drafted Trey Harris as well. And then they also have Quentin Johnston. Like I think Quentin Johnston's going to continue to make a leap for this team and for the Chargers. Um, and I also just, for me, something I've also realized is just like how good of a coach Jim Harbaugh is. Like, Jim Harbaugh is such an elite coach. I didn't realize it as much just purely because he's bounced around from NFL to college and but if you really look at what Jim Harbaugh has been able to accomplish as a head coach, like you do realize like, oh, this guy is like one of the best to ever do it. Like everywhere Jim Harbaugh has gone, he's seen success. Like he truly has. Like he put Stanford on the map. Remember when Stanford was like a dominant program? No one talks about Stanford anymore. They haven't talked about Stanford since Jim Harbaugh left. No one cares about Stanford football anymore. But Jim Harbaugh made them relevant. Michigan again, they were in a terrible place. Ask Taylor Lewan what it was like playing for Michigan under a different coach. Like there are so many people that hated and felt and like there are so many years that Michigan just disappointed until they got Jim Harbaugh. He ended up with a national championship. Move forward to the Chargers. He's now getting the Chargers to the playoffs, right? I think that the Chargers have a chance to go 11-6 this year. I think they're going to repeat in a very tough division, and I think they're gonna be the top team coming out of the AFC West. I truly no, sorry. I think they'll actually be. Let me kind of think about this. Yeah, no, like I think that they're going to be the top team coming out of the AFC West. I really do think that. I think they're going to be just ahead of the Kansas City Chiefs. Last team I'm going to talk about before we sign off today is the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, Kansas City Chiefs, here's what I'll say. And maybe it's because of who I'm a fan of, maybe it's just because I think people get sort of fatigue of this team. The Chiefs went 15-2 last year, which if you were to actually relive last year, you would never believe that because there were so many times where they should have lost games. But at the same time, that is what makes the Chiefs such a good team. Is they find ways to win games in every situation. It doesn't matter if it was Patrick Mahomes needs to have a game-winning drive, or they need to have a game-winning field goal, or their defense needs to make a stop, right? They just found ways to win games. Like they dealt with so many injuries last year as well, right? Rashee Rice, Hollywood Brown, Isaiah Pacheco, right? Like they had so many injuries on that offensive side, and Mahomes had, in all sense of the terms, in his career, probably like a down year, right? He threw for like 3,900 yards. Like he didn't hit 1,000 yards. Like everyone watch out. He had 26 touchdowns and 11 interceptions, right? He didn't have the best year last year, and they still made it to the Super Bowl. Like it doesn't make sense other than the fact that they are just an elite team. That is all you have to understand about them is they find ways to win, and they are an elite team. I love the draft pick they had, right, with Josh Simmons. Everyone is so excited about Josh Simmons in Kansas City, and I think he's going to be a huge reason why Patrick Mahomes is able to stay, upright and get to throw the ball downfield this year. I am definitely still worried about their receiving core, right? Rashee Rice is out for the first 6 games this year with a suspension due to an incident that he had back in like 2023 that's finally being like answered for, which that's a whole nother topic for another day. But Travis Kelce, he's older, right? I think he's a great competitor. I like him as a person too. Like I wish I didn't, but like Travis Kelce is like an awesome dude, and I'm happy for him and Taylor Swift. I think this is his last year, and so you got to ask yourself is like, does he just put it all out there this year? Like, does he have sort of like a comeback season this season? Or, does he kind of show out and fades off into the sunset, right? Like, I'm not – my money's on the fact that I think Travis Kelce will actually have a solid year this year, sort of out of necessity because again, they just constantly have injuries they deal with. Like the other big question is like how many games will Hollywood Brown play for the Chiefs this year? Somehow Xavier Worthy, who's like the same style and build as Hollywood Brown, stayed healthy all of last season and played. So like I won't touch on that, but like I just don't know if Hollywood Brown is going to be a viable receiver for them for the entire season. And so a lot is going to ride on Travis Kelce, in my opinion, for how they do. I do like their defense, and I like their defense for one specific reason. It's that they have a stud at every single like aspect of like every single position, right? Every single line of defense they have a stud at. And what I mean by that is like you have Chris Jones. I'll even put George Karlaftis in there. I'll put George Karlaftis, their edge rusher, in there. They have Nick Bolton at linebacker, and then Trent McDuffie at corner, right? They have a stud like essentially at every position, and I think that's what allows them to make up for mistakes that they have. It's the fact that they always have sort of someone that can save them in these situations. So again, when it comes to actually prediction, I, I'm actually going to put the Chiefs at second, and I think they're going to end up with an 11-6 record, right? I think which will tie the Chargers, but I think the Chargers will have some sort of tiebreaker. I think this is the first year the Chargers do not win the division. I see them going to the playoffs, right? But I think based off of some crazy tiebreaker, I have them going second in the division behind the Los Angeles Chargers. So that's really where I see the AFC West going. Again, Chargers being number one, Chiefs just behind them at number two. Then you have the Broncos, and then you have the Raiders in last place. So that's really where I see them ending up. That's all I have to cover today. Again, I know that's a lot of information. Going through these season previews by division is a lot. I appreciate everyone that joined in. Tell me what you think about this upcoming season. Who are some breakout players from this division that you expect to see out there? I appreciate you all joining. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. This is Bad Takes with Bad Takes in Football, signing out.